All right, so I'm Luis Rocha. I'm at the School of Informatics and Computing, and also affiliated occasionally with the Instituto Gulbenkian Ciência in Portugal. So before I go on, let me acknowledge the members of my group because they participated and collaborated in all the work that I'm going to present next. There are a number of them. Some of them are no longer in the group, but I'm still showing them there because they participated in the work that I'm going to describe. In the meantime, they moved on. All right, so there's a number of projects that I work on that could be relevant for this presentation, namely on text mining of biomedical areas and social media and political unrest and so forth. But I decided to focus first on things that I think are more networkish, as it were, especially dealing with dynamics. Which is where I think network science should move on into. And so if I have time at the end, I can mention some of the other projects, but I will start with this. So just to give you a typical example of what network science is used for, say in biomedical domain, but this could be in the social domain, it could be in many other areas. So how does this work? Oh, it is. This is the red one. Okay. Oh, the big one is the blinding one. All right, I can point at it. So usually you collect some network data from co-occurrence data or some kind of a co-association data that you bring from some data set. In the biomedical domain, you try to find interactions between genes and proteins. Say this is what these people have done in this paper, and then they look at these networks to study what I can refer to as organized complexity. This is the term that Warren Weaver in the 1940s first described to propose the study of complexity. And what we do is study organized complexity, basically how the units are organized. And from this, then we have certain conclusions that ensue from this. In this case, they look at the modules between pre-mRNAs and proteins in this particular organism and make inferences from this. So, but there is a need, particularly in biomedical domains, that we move from understanding organized complexity into controlling complexity. So not just to figure out how things are organized, but how can I go about poking some of these variables such that they behave the way I like. So for instance, if you have a model of a cancer cell, you want to know how to move a cancer cell from a disease state to a healthy state. So you want to know which nodes you want to intervene to do that, rather than just knowing how they are organized. And so the network science is moving towards control a lot. It's been used recently. But I think in order to tackle these problems, we can approach it from the point of view of three things. Looking at patterns of connectivity, which network science has been really good at for the last couple of decades, or at least a decade and a half of looking at how networks are organized, scale-free networks and so forth. We can look at patterns of dynamics that, in particularly, more the SFI type of complexity has been looking a lot at dynamical systems, and we have a lot of people in this campus that deal with dynamical systems. And then there's another one that I argue that people haven't been looking into a lot of detail, in addition to dynamics that I think they need to look more, which are patterns of redundancy. And this is what I'm going to talk about, two projects of mine that look at patterns of redundancy related to dynamics on networks or just the organization of networks. So that's where I'm going on. So first, let me look at a project that deals with patterns of redundancy in dynamics. Here, I'm just going to introduce a model that is quite famous in systems biology and complexity that was done by Rocha Albert as a model of the Drosophila segment polarity network. This just to introduce the concept of a Boolean network. So if you are, the Boolean network is described here of this model, and the uppercase nodes mean proteins and the lowercase nodes mean genes of this small subset of network that participate in the development of the Drosophila embryo. So if you have a network like a graph and you want to study dynamics, perhaps the simplest step to do that is to add node states to each node. So basically, add node dynamics. In other words, the node can be on or off. That becomes kind of a Boolean network because the node might be expressed, in the case of the biological domain, or inhibited, or on and off, and so forth. And so that's the simplest step you can do move from a graph to something that is a dynamical system. And this is what we call an automata network. In this case, a Boolean network. You could have more states. And so these have been used a lot in systems biology to model actual systems. In this case, then, each node has then a particular logical expression with ands and ors and other logical expressions that tell you at the next time step what is going to be your state from this update. So, for instance, the node CIA updates from all these other 6 nodes that connect to it, okay, with a logical expression. So if you run this model, then they converge into attractors. And these attractors represent cell states. Eventually, they quickly converge to an attractor, and they represent cell states. In this case, in this model, there are several attractors. One of them represents the wild type of the segment polarity network, what the embryo usually converges to, and the others represent mutants, known mutants. So this model quite accurately captures the development of the embryo, of this subsystem. So then we can study this. Now, just for a simple detail here, this model is of a single cell. It has 70 nodes. When you look at this, only the single cell, you can coalesce them into 15 nodes because they depend. These blue nodes are input nodes that depend on the state of neighboring cells where the same system occurs. Except for SLP, that it's supposed to represent the sloppy pair protein that happens upstream in the development of the same cell. So the full model is 4 of those networks in what is called a parasegment. So in the total has 60 nodes, and that's what you try to converge to see if when it converges to an attractor, if it does these stripes that become kind of the wild type and so forth. This is just an example. It could be any other network. It could be a social network too. But just to tell you the kind of networks when you want to move away from just looking at the structure of networks, but want to look at the dynamics, what the kinds of things you could do. So one of the things we've been working on is to simplify these models because, as I just said, even though this one only has 15 nodes, so its state space is 2 to the power of 15, which is amenable to full search, the full model has 4 networks of 60 nodes, and that's 2 to the power of 60. So you can't possibly search the entire state space to know what happens and what controls what in that network. So it's important to reduce the complexity of these for analysis. So one technique we've been looking at, we call schemata redescription, is when we look at the lookup tables of automata and try to simplify them, remove the redundancy. And I'm going to try to explain, this is the central aspect of our approach. So what you have here is the lookup table of a generic automata, not from this model, just a generic one, in all the states that go to 1. Right? So on the right side, you say the next state of this node will be 1, and it depends on 6 inputs. Right? The k, the in degree is 6. All the other states go to 0, so I don't need to put them here. I only need to know one or the other. If you look closely, this bunch of 4 here can be described in a smaller schema in which we introduce the wildcard symbol. That wildcard symbol means that no matter what the state of these 2 inputs is, as long as I have this on the 4 inputs, I go to 1. As you can see, you have the binary expansion here, so they are all redundant in terms of computing the state to 1. So as long as the 4 first inputs are in that state, the next one is going to be 1. So those are redundant for that decision. If you apply this to the whole automata, and we do this with an algorithm called Quine-McCluskey from computer science that has been used since the 60s for circuit minimization in circuit design, then what you do is you find what are called the prime implicants and are these schemata that redescribe this entire thing. So now we can compute what is called canalization. This is a term that Waddington first brought up in theoretical biology, but Stuart Kauffman has proposed very much recently, and is to measure canalization. So one way we go about measuring canalization, which has to do that even though a network or a system may have many inputs, only a few control it, the network is canalized in its dynamics, we go and compute the average number of wildcards in its redescription. So for the entire lookup table, on average, how many wildcards exist? And that's what that expression, it's more complicated, explains. That's a quantity we call input redundancy. So in this case, there's always 2 wildcards, so the input redundancy is 2. For this lookup table, there's always 2 inputs that are redundant in any circumstance, okay? A very relevant, a very similar measure is sort of the opposite of this, which we call effective connectivity. That's the input, the original in degree minus the input redundancy. So that tells us what is the actual connectivity on average of that node. So the average connectivity of that node is 6, which is the in degree, minus 2, which is the input redundancy, it's 4. On average, you always need 4 inputs to control that network. But notice, the structure was telling me that the input to that node was 6, but it turns out most of the time it's 4. So if I only go look at the network and graph theoretical analysis of this, I can make wrong assumptions about what the actual dynamics happen. And this is very true, particularly for this very in vogue structural controllability approach that has been used a lot in network science these days. Another measure, this is a newer one that we came up with, has to do with this last step here, which is this can be further redescribed if we add another symbol. So now we add this second symbol, which is a little circle on top of some inputs. That means those inputs that are marked with a circle can permutate. So in other words, this whole thing can be subsumed to a single schema that says, as long as input 2 is 0, input 3 is 1, and among the other 4s, there's 1, 0, and 1, 1, this goes to 1. That's what this whole thing says. So this, we argue, is another type of canalization, another type of redundancy that is saying, on average, 4 of your inputs can be switched around, and it doesn't make any difference on the output. So on average, you need 4 inputs, and also 4 inputs can permutate. So these are 2 forms of canalization that we argued recently. And so what does this bias? So this is exploiting all the redundancy. What does this bias? If we go back to the Drosophila model, for instance, and we go gene by gene and protein by protein, we realize a lot of them are very redundant. See, where you see grays here and circles, they are very redundant. For instance, the CIA and CIR, they have an in degree of 6, but they have a 1.5 and 1.0 weight effective connectivity. So even though they receive 6 inputs on average, only 1 input and a little more is needed to compute its state. All right, and all the others. We also have normalized versions of these in which we basically divide this by k. And so you can compute that and then analyze this model. So in this space of, we call this the space of canalization, we have the 2 types of canalization. We can see that some nodes are very canalized of both types of canalization and some are not as much. In particular, worth noticing here, the CII and CIR have a lot of connectivity. And by the way, this figure is not completely right. There should be an arrow from here to there too. It's those 2, even though they have high connectivity, and many graph theoretical analysis will pick them as important nodes on this network, they actually very canalized, and they actually don't participate almost at all in the dynamics of this network. Okay, so this is the sort of thing we do. For the next step, I'm not going to go into the details of this. One of the key questions that my group is interested in is to understand natural computation, is to understand how cells compute and collectives of cells compute in particular. So this technique allows us to glimpse into how a cell makes its decision making in a way. So the way we do this is we analyze the micro level now, node per node. We didn't do anything at the macro level. There is one passage that is interesting to understand this computation, is that we can convert the set of schemata of any automata into a neural network, basically a threshold network, very similar to a McCulloch and Pitts network. And this is very simply done. So this is the generic automaton I had before, now with the states that go to off to, but so you have the complete lookup table. And you can see that to go to on, all it needs 4 things to happen. That I2 is off, that I3 is on, and there's at least one of these that is on and one of these that is off. If those 4 conditions are met, it goes to off. And vice versa this goes to on, that goes to off. So I have this for every node. So if I pick now, so I have this map for every single node in that model. So if I now put them together, we come up with what we call the dynamics canalization map, which is a neural network that contains everything that is required, and only what is required to move a state in the dynamics. So all redundancy was removed of the original dynamics, and by going node by node and assembling, I can compute this neural network and know what the network does. In particular, one very cool thing about this is that I don't need to know the initial states of any of them to compute this. So I can, for instance, say, what happens if all I know about this, the only thing I can actually, let's say I'm a doctor and I want to change the state of a network. The only thing I can control is the state of the wingless protein in the neighbor cell of a given cell in the biological organism. If all I know is this, that I can inhibit it, I know that all of this will for sure happen in this case. So this entire pink module will happen no matter what the states of the other networks do. So this is what we call a dynamical module. It's decoupled from the rest of the dynamics. Doesn't matter what the others are doing, this will always happen as long as this happens or the sloppy pair protein is on. The blue module is even bigger, but it requires two things to happen, which are the opposite of that. If the neighbor wingless protein is expressed or the sloppy pair protein is inhibited, then this whole thing is guaranteed to happen. It's completely decoupled from the rest of the dynamics. I'd just like you, to see how this is interesting, compare this to the state space of the entire network of just one, has 2 to the power of 70 nodes. It's really large, but all of this dynamics is actually subsumed with this, and I can query it with this one, with unknown information. So doing that, querying this like this allows us to find control patterns. And I'm just going to go a little bit because I still want to talk about something else. So what you see in these plots is assume these 3 nodes are the most important ones. And here I subsume these into a single node, but I will not go into those details. These are input nodes to the network. I want to know how much control can I do on this network only by controlling the input networks. If I only set these states, what happens to that regardless of those states? So what you see in these plots is all the possible combinations of those 3 inputs that are here on the side, and you don't know any of the states of the network initially and this is time. So if you only know that those are inhibited, expressed, inhibited, then the whole blue module happens here, and you know exactly what happens. Another module that I'm not describing also happens here. And so most of the time, these 3 are completely sufficient to control the network. Most of the time. There's only a couple of instances where you need to know additional information. This, for instance, even though it has a lot of grays, can only converge to one attractor. There's 5 possible attractors in this case, and that can only converge to a single attractor. So there's very little uncertainty. This network is almost entirely controllable by the input nodes. For instance, structural controllability, for those of you who know, predicts this needs 4 nodes, including either CIR or PTC, in order to control it as driver nodes. But you don't need that. You just need these 3 to control it. Okay. We did this then. This model is the simple one that is completely searchable. You have 2 to the power of 15 or 17, depending on how you compute this. But when you do the full model, the full segment polarity model with 2 to the power of 60, we can also do this and find out what is the minimum requirement of the 4 cells to make sure that you converge to the wild type attractor. That's what would be interesting for a biologist, to find out what guarantees that the embryo is going to develop to wild type and not to a mutant. With this approach, we found that the wild type attractor is much larger than previously computed by Rocha Albert, and now we know it's much larger than the original paper showed that it was. Okay, so we do a lot of things about this. We are applying it now to a lot of other networks. There's a database called the Cell Collective, where systems biologists deposit such automata models of many systems. And so we are large-scale analyzing all of those to see what sort of how canalization is pervasive in these models. That's forthcoming work. Another most of the work that I showed before was done with Manuel Marques Pito. It's a postdoc with me at Gulbenkian. This work is done with Santosh. here, which is sort of an output from this work too. So this is not about specific biological networks, but it has to do with something complexity people love, which is study criticality on networks. So the current theory tells us that if you generate random Boolean networks, like the ones I just did now, that most of the time they will be chaotic. Most of the time they will be oscillating all over the space in the attractor space, okay? So this is the plot from Aldana, where you have the in degree here, and you have bias of the mean bias of the nodes of the network. And the mean bias is a quantity of the automata rule that says how many ones you have. So if your automata always goes to 1, you are here. If it always goes to 0, goes here. If you are in 0.5, means you go equally to on and off. Okay? So most of the time, you're really in chaotic dynamics. The interesting thing is that this looks like, when it's published, looks like it's a very crisp theory, but it isn't. It is actually a very fuzzy theory. If you go and generate networks with these parameters, like we did here, you realize that well into the chaotic regime, you find many stable networks. Green represents stable, and red represents chaotic here for k's up to 8. We ran all of them up to 6. 8 is a sample because it's a large space. And so we can see this is actually quite fuzzy. If we now use our measure of effective connectivity instead of in degree and recompute this, so the effective connectivity measure that I just showed you, you can see that the separation is much cleaner. Right? So here, instead of having in degree like I have here, I have effective in degree, if you want to put it that way. And you can see the surface that we obtain is very simple, is a constant divided by effective connectivity. If you plot this, the transition from chaos to stability is much cleaner. In fact, we can actually measure that very clearly. So this is the current theory. If you apply machine learning techniques, this is the accuracy, the F1, the Matthews correlation coefficient of what you would predict with the current theory, and if you would predict with our theory, and you can see it increases a lot, the performance. So predicting chaos from using effective connectivity is much better than using in degree, which means that actually there's a lot of redundancy in the original calculations that were not taken into account. So this is a work in preparation. We're about to submit this with Santosh, so it's part of his dissertation here. All right, I have a few minutes. Okay. Right, so I just wanted to mention one that I've been talking about. I'm going to try to go very quickly with this. This is all about graphs. It's not about dynamics. So for a while, many of you have seen me talk about this. I've been interested in this isomorphism between what I call proximity networks and distance networks. So proximity networks are weighted networks you obtain from co-occurrence data, in which a strong edge means that you have a strong co-occurrence, very much what Giovanni just used. And then we convert them to distance to do the sorts of things Giovanni did, to compute shortest paths. And we do this in network science all the time. The most simple function you can use to convert these is 1 over the proximity minus 1 to make sure it's a distance function. One of the things that I've observed, oh, this is supposed to be less or equal. See, when I use other computers, symbols get messed up. So this, a lot of the time we would expect these edges to be metric in the distance space, meaning that they would obey the triangle inequality. The shortest edge is always the direct edge. But it turns out a lot of the time they break the triangle inequality. So there is a shorter indirect path than a direct path. This is what we call a semi-metric edge. I've applied this to recommender systems, to text mining in biology for many years with some success. But the point that I wanted to express here is that there is an isomorphism between these spaces of the distance space that equates with to algorithms of transitive closure in computer science. And so we guarantee they convert. The one that Giovanni did, which is the most common in network science, is the Dijkstra algorithm to compute shortest path. And that in this space is a matrix composition of the minimum operator. You're computing the shortest path with the plus operator. You're adding the values of the edges. So that's the min plus. That is a well-known transitive closure in fuzzy graphs, for instance. But this isomorphism allows us to explore a lot more of these. There's many more. There's, for instance, an ultrametric closure that instead of doing min plus here, does the min-max, which is known as min-max composition in the literature. But there's many in between that you could do, okay? What I wanted to show in terms of redundancy, which is the topic of this, is when you do the sort of thing Giovanni did, you start with a distance graph and compute all the shortest paths. You're doing a transitive closure of that graph, which I call here the metric closure. It turns out, this is an interesting thing, that there's an invariant subgraph of this original graph. There's a graph that when you do this does not change the weight of any edge. That invariant subgraph is what we call a metric backbone. And if you're not using the metric closure but any other transitive closure, we call this a distance backbone. This, in computer science, there's very similar notions called transitive reduction and shortest path subgraphs, and they are slightly different from what we're showing here, but there's no time to go into it. All I wanted to show is that these semi-metric edges that are here but are not here, those are the semi-metric edges, are redundant. You never need them to compute the shortest path. So in the graph that we used for Giovanni's work, 98% of the edges were semi-metric, which means that all those inferences that he was doing only were computed on 2% of the edges, all right? And so I'm not going to go into detail except to show you many famous networks where this is very prevalent. This is the US Sport network that was published in this paper by Victoria and Alex that has the available airplane seats between US cities. This is the original graph as a distance graph. This is the metric backbone of that network. For instance, look at this node here. It had a ton of connections to other cities. But when you compute, that's why we pull it down. When you compute the metric backbone, it has a single path, which means to go to any city, it always has to go through something else. To have the shortest. The ultrametric is even smaller. We can talk about this. And this is the difference between the metric and ultrametric, which are also interesting to see. Just to show, I'm almost done. This shows that the amount of semi-metricity is also a power law. So most nodes are just slightly semi-metric, and there's a few of those that are very semi-metric. So this also has a power law variation in the semi-metric behavior. It's something to explore later. We looked at a lot of networks, some in collaboration with Olaf, and computed the metric backbone and the ultrametric backbone. In this network, 91% of the edges are irrelevant. And so we did this. What's taking longer to publish is doing this in a lot of networks. We now completed, there's all the levels of semi-metricity in a lot of networks. This was done with Tiago Simas in his dissertation. We also compute the modularity on the backbone rather than the original network, and the quality of modularity increases a lot. So this is work, ongoing work. And I just wanted to say that this is possible to compute, and this was the project these guys did. And as I said, just to link it back to the previous talk, 98% of that graph is semi-metric, which is quite interesting, I think. So I'll finish here and hope.
Again, we have time for questions. First of all, thanks to the speaker. I think one thing which we have uniquely at IU is that we really try to look at networks across multiple levels, so from micro to macro level. The other part that we have here is that we have 100+ network science researchers which now could say, wow, I want that backbone picture, or I want that other thing that you just presented, and oh my God, I can actually sit together and have a coffee with you and do stuff together. So in my world, we have scholarly networks, and many of our clients and also research collaborators, they're extremely interested to understand how they can modify the science system to achieve certain objectives. For instance, more women in STEM, or more ethnic balance for those which get NIH funding. And however, in our world, oftentimes new, for instance, funding opportunities are implemented, the entire system reacts to it. So it doesn't just do the old network, it actually constructs a new network, new regulations, etc. So it's always interesting to me and how far I can take some of the pieces that I just saw and apply them to my system. And oftentimes, if you have people that can actually do rational decision making, they're going to screw it up, It's not going to work in the same way. But if you have a system that's maybe, I'm not going to go over to brains, but maybe particles, they would always react in the same way if you actually apply physical forces there. So I think there are limits, but also lots of opportunities.
Giovanni applied this to that very large network, and he has to struggle a lot, right? I mean, it's a very large graph to compute the backbone, also the ultrametric backbone. So.
But on the other hand, once you have it.
Once you have it, then you can throw away all the edges that are redundant too. Yeah.
Any other comments?
I have actually a little bit different view. So think about you have a complex network, and think about like how to say we are working on citation graph, for example. So if we keep the backbone age, the backbone node, for example, and so the most ages is linked to the very important papers, maybe, right? So for example, if domain, there's a very big name, so hopefully the age only connected to this very big name, right? But from ranking viewpoint, like for Google Scholar search, actually the ranking hypothesis can be different. For example, we want to give actual bonus for those new coming researchers, not yet save a lot of citation, but however potentially can be important.
Yeah.
So in that case, I mean, I totally agree with you for that. So if we can remove a number of ages, it will have some benefits for the computation. But do you think there's other ways to find it? I mean, not at this stage, but in the future stage, if some nodes can be right now not that important yet, but can be important in the future.
So I have a lot of observational evidence, which just suggests, I don't have a model that shows this yet, that networks early in their evolution tend to be more semi-metric, and then as they converge as a committee, as a community, they tend to be less semi-metric. So in other words, those nodes that are only very faintly connected can become then, if in the future, very well connected because there's a very strong indirect path. But in the future, they become connected more strongly. So we apply that to a lot of networks, and we usually see that. So for instance, if you look at the network of co-occurrence in text of the most common words in English, they're not very semi-metric because their relationships are quite well established. So all I could say is, as an intuition, and I didn't look at these data sets, so we could look. A young scientist, it kind of depends, and maybe this is a hypothesis we can formulate here. If a young scientist is very well connected to an advisor who is very well connected to others, there's already a strong path that is indirect. So even though the young researcher doesn't have a lot of citations or connections to other scientists, or maybe has just a few, just the fact that there is a strong path that is indirect to somebody might bring that young scientist into sort of a very productive area. And if you're not, then it might not. But these are things we could test with these networks. We could go and look at time. And so I think this kind of analysis affords a lot of this kind of treatment to see that kind of dynamics at play. I mean, in fact, I just want to say that was the intuition behind the recommendation systems we built with this technique back when I was in Los Alamos, which is to say the things that were very semi-metric are things that people are not yet choosing, but might want to choose in the future. So we were recommending those. Instead of just recommending the things that you bought and others bought, we would recommend a little further through that. So that was the intuition.
Reduction, I'm not really the multi-scale network. So it's still a scale-free network.
That's a good. We did look at that. The metric backbone tends not to change the scale-free, but the ultrametric changes it. The ultrametric is much stronger, and the ultrametric tends to make so the ultrametric is basically saying you choose the shortest path not by adding the edges, by choosing the weakest link. And therefore, everything is really connected to everything. And so when you compute that closure, you have a huge, ball of it. If the graph was connected, it becomes super connected, right? And so that destroys the scale free. Doing the closure, it's not the backbone itself. So the closure itself is what destroys. So in fact, I don't know if these are still the correct results. I have this from that he gave me. So this is, but it gives you a general idea, but it's not completely correct. When you compute the metric and the ultrametric and try to do the inferences he did, here is just to to try to guess the party of the House Congress people on his DBpedia. If we only use the original graph, which is we call baseline, this is your performance, about 54%. If you do the metric, you get a much higher performance. But if you do the ultrametric, you go back to sort of the original performance. Really doing the ultrametric is too much inference. You're inferring things that are very connected that are not. So that kind of destroys the network. But the shortest path sort of seems to be a sweet spot in the sort of analysis. And it doesn't. In the paper we are preparing with Tiago, there's a lot of analysis of all these networks, how the scale-free network was changed with the closure. But the backbone doesn't change anything, right? The backbone is just saying that's the minimum you need to compute exactly the same thing. So it's an invariant graph, but the backbone is sufficient to compute that. So you kind of preserve all of the original network. The edges that you have here participate in things like clustering coefficient, degree, modularity, but don't participate in anything like betweenness, efficiency, and that sort of thing. So they might be needed for some, small world analysis, but not for other type of analysis.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So next Monday, come back.